welcome to a brand new episode of Battle Cry, the only show on Indian television that gets you up close with Indian weapons, war fighters, and how this country defends itself. A question that has popped up periodically over a number of years, and especially after the Ladakh standoff began, is does India need strategic long-range bomber aircraft?
They are the big, bad tanks of the sky. Slow, ominous, and devastating. The nuclear age began with them. They have seen action in most wars. Now they stand ready to overwhelm. As China beefs up on its bomber fleet, Battle Cry goes deep on two big questions. Why doesn't India have bombers? And will India ever need the bombers?
The journey must start at the very beginning, so strap in for this report on why India at one point did operate bombers, but for many years now has simply stopped. Here's a total look at why India doesn't have bombers and doesn't feel the need for them. In August 2020, these alarming satellite photos emerged from China's Kashgar Air Base, 475 kilometers north of Ladakh. In these images, Chinese Xi'an H-6 long-range bombers sighted for the first time this close to the Indian border. The images triggered a question that has sprung up from time to time over the years, but never really laid to rest. If India's chief adversary in the region has bombers, why doesn't India have long-range bomber aircraft of its own? The answer to that question is a complex but riveting one. So strap in as Battle Cry takes you on a journey of discovery and facts. Before we set off on this journey, first let's define a strategic bomber aircraft. A strategic bomber aircraft is typically a heavy intercontinental range aircraft capable of carrying large quantities of bombs and missiles of all kinds with the capacity to also deliver nuclear weapons. Aircraft like the B-52 are typically used for heavy bombing campaigns in airspace where such bombers are not vulnerable to surface-to-air weaponry and countermeasures. And now let's begin our journey at the very beginning with this question. Has India ever operated heavy bomber aircraft? Did you know that India operated 3 squadrons? The answer to that is an interesting one. Did you know that India operated 2 squadrons of vintage American-built B-24 Liberators from independence till 1968? In 1947, these aircraft were abandoned by the British at Kanpur's Chakeri airfield as junk. In hurry to leave independent India, but also keen not to leave serviceable aircraft for the new nation, the British damaged the aircraft with bulldozers, poured sand into their engines, and generally left them pretty much grounded. But in 1948, at the height of the Kashmir operations and the invasion by Pakistani forces, India felt the need for a heavy bomber capable of blitzkrieg-style operations. And so the Indian Air Force decided to raise the Liberators from their graveyard in Kanpur, managing to salvage 2 squadrons of the venerable aircraft, literally raised from the dead. The liberators would see 2 decades of active service before being retired in 1968. In 1954, the Indian Air Force began hunting for a new bomber, finally choosing to acquire over 50 British-built Canberra medium bombers. The Canberra fleet would go on to become the bombing backbone of the Indian Air Force, performing missions across India's conflict history, including photo reconnaissance missions in the 1962 war with China and bombing missions in the 1965 and 1971 operations against Pakistan. After half a century of service, the last of the Canberras were retired in 2007. Ever since, India has neither inducted any purpose-built bomber aircraft nor felt the need to pursue any such procurement. And that brings us to the question, why doesn't India feel the need for heavy bombers? This is a question with multi-layered answers. Let's tackle them one by one. The first major reason is the changing nature of warfare over the last half-century. In the past, bomber aircraft were seen as a key component of a country's military strategy, used for strategic bombing and air raids. But with the advent of precision-guided munitions and drone technology, the role of bombers has been diminished, especially between well-armed nations. Not envisioning large-scale bombing raids in its military mission requirements, India has instead invested in fighter bomber aircraft, capable of deploying standoff range, precision-guided strike weapons. Another major factor is cost. Developing and maintaining a bomber aircraft is a costly undertaking, and India has limited resources to devote to military spending, preferring to spend on fighter jets, transport aircraft and helicopters rather than heavy bombers. India also relies on other forms of firepower such as cruise missiles like the BrahMos, soon to be inducted Nirbhay, and the air-launched Scalp. A third reason is that India primarily focuses on air-to-air and air-to-ground missions like the Balakot airstrike, and heavy bombers are not typically used in these types of operations. A fourth reason could be India's defense strategy, which is focused on maintaining a credible deterrent against its potential adversaries while keeping its military capabilities at a level that is commensurate with its security needs. India has a diverse range of adversaries, and a heavy bomber fleet might not be considered necessary to counter all of them. Despite this, especially in the media, India periodically comes face to face with the question of bomber aircraft as the country's territorial disputes with neighboring Pakistan and China continue to escalate. In 2020, news reports emerged that India was actively considering acquiring Russian Tupolev Tu-160 Blackjack strategic bombers, but these rumors have since evaporated. Some experts argue that a bomber aircraft would give India a strategic advantage in any potential conflict, allowing the country to strike deep into enemy territory without risking the loss of pilots or expensive fighter jets. As things stand, however, an overwhelming majority of Indian military thought believes bombers are redundant in such hotly contested airspace. Furthermore, India has been developing its own defense capabilities and equipment, and the country has made significant progress in developing its own fighter jets, transport aircraft and helicopters. These aircraft are being developed to meet the specific requirements of the Indian Air Force and the country's defense strategy. But that doesn't mean bomber aircraft overall are redundant. Starting with the B-2 Spirit and soon with the B-21 Raider, the United States has pioneered the art of the invisible bomber, capable of creeping stealthily into even contested airspace to conduct heavy bombing missions. India is developing a far smaller stealth bomber called Ghatak, an unmanned vehicle that will, in theory, be capable of penetrating deep into enemy airspace, drop a small quantity of strike weaponry and return theoretically unharmed. But as far as heavy strategic bombers are concerned, India is clear it doesn't need any. Not at this time anyway. So we've just shown you here on Battle Cry the context in which some of those reports have been popping up from time to time. But let's listen to the experts to get a real-world view on whether those questions are real questions, whether there has ever been a need for bombers, or is this just something that the media reports from time to time. Joining me live on Battle Cry is Air Marshal Anil Chopra. He's director of the Centre for Air Power Studies. He's a veteran fighter pilot himself. Angad Singh is one of India's best-known aviation writers. He's also a military historian and researcher. And also with us is Group Captain A. Vinod, who is an Indian Air Force veteran and commentator. Gentlemen, good evening. Thank you very much for being with us here on Battle Cry. Air Marshal Chopra, to you first. You have written about this issue of India and strategic bombers. You've offered a pretty comprehensive view of what these could be used for, why India doesn't have them. But you also argue that there may come a time that, there could be a situation where India might need strategic heavy bombers of the kind that we see in the United States and elsewhere. Why do you say that, sir, and what do you think?
Firstly, Shiv, thank you for having me here. And you know that only 3 countries in the world have got bombers as of today. These are USA, Russia, and China. They are the 3 most powerful militaries. India is the 4th largest military, and therefore this debate that should we have a bomber or not. Remember that we have had bombers, so has UK, France, and of course in Second World War, Germans had bombers. So there are countries who have had bombers, but they left them. So to understand whether India needs or not and when should we have, I think there are 2 areas which we must look at first. What are the advantages of a bomber and what are the disadvantages? The first big advantage for a bomber is a large aircraft. It will have long range. It can, it can carry much larger number of weapons nowadays. Cruise missiles. There are some bombers which are even supersonic. There are bombers which are stealth. And there is more power source on a bomber. That power source has become very important now because direct energy weapons, lasers, they all will require huge power source, and there are many bombers which can subsequently be converted into electronic warfare role. The bomber could be converted into a refueler and things like that. And let us look at quickly the disadvantages. A bigger aircraft, bigger target, a costlier aircraft, stealth to be achieved in a bomber will be so much more difficult. And many of the roles that once bombers used to do have been taken over by fighters and that's why many of the fighters are called fighter bombers, and these aircraft also have their own self-protection, electronic warfare. So with these advantages and disadvantages, why India? So first thing in India is that we are short of even fighter aircraft. We are down to 30 squadrons. First, we have to fill up the fighter numbers. Second, what is our continental role right now? We are not yet a global power. Our requirement is from Gulf of Hormuz to Malacca, and these 2 roles can currently be met by the Su-30 and the Rafale with FRA available. So therefore, these fighters can also carry cruise missiles. So therefore, at this instant, the priority for Indian Air Force, as I said in some of my writings, is to get our fighter numbers up and use these fighters with extended range with FRAs. And maybe later, but one day if we have to be a global power, and subsequently we have to really dominate the whole of Indian Ocean right down, the middle and to the southern parts, then we will require bombers, and that my feeling is in timelines of around 20 years from now. Yes. Okay,
so you're saying not now, but maybe 20 years from now. Angad, where do these questions keep cropping up from? The last time we saw media reports talking about bombers, there were some saying India is looking at the, the blackjack bomber from the Russia. Was the time when those satellite pictures during the Ladakh standoff emerged of, Chinese bombers at certain bases in Xinjiang and Tibet, etc. Where does this come from? Has the Indian Air Force ever been seriously looking at acquiring this kind of thing?
Look, I've never been privy to any plans of the Air Forces that involve. Right. So like I was saying, I've never been privy to any plans of the Indian Air Force that have talked about acquiring bombers, and I think at least part of the rationale for it could just be, certainly educated kite flying by certain analysts and commentators. And as to why the blackjack is mentioned, it's pretty simple. It's because it's the only bomber accessible to the Indian Air Force that one can buy off the shelf. There are no live exportable production lines open to India at the moment. We can't buy US bombers because they're not cleared for export, and we obviously aren't going to buy Chinese bombers, which leaves only Russian strategic bombers as the as a plausible option for the Indian Air Force. Moving on to the why and whether we should, I have to agree with Air Marshal Chopra. This is definitely not a conversation for the present day. Given the not just the lack of investment that's gone into air power in recent years, but it's more to do with holistically building up military capability and prioritizing funding not just to air power but across all three services, and the challenges there are enormous, and frankly it doesn't bear thinking about that these existing challenges should now be muddied by talk of acquiring strategic bombers. It's also, I think, beyond the time issue. I think what the Air Marshal was alluding to was the issue of affordability, centrally speaking, beyond tactics and strategy. But even if bombers are affordable, when India is at 5 trillion, 6 trillion, 10 trillion many years down the line, it's also to do with the political will and the political directive to the armed forces. If the armed forces, even of a $10 trillion GDP India, if the armed forces are still mandated to safeguard the sovereignty of India, and India does not lay claim to any overseas interests or conflict zones, then even then bombers are a moot question then, because anything you need to do within the present political mandate or something similar to it down the line doesn't require strategic bombers at all.
Okay. Group Captain Vinod, educated kite flying by analysts and the media, the fact that we don't need them now, but we perhaps will need them later. Is there a section within the Indian Air Force that believes that bombers are a necessity in the foreseeable future? And where do you stand on this, sir?
No, I have been always for having a strategic bomber, and Shiv, I'll tell you why. Did Indian Air Force or India have it in the past? Of course we had it. Very recently we retired the English Electric Canberra. Canberra was a long-range strategic bomber. I mean, it can take off from Srinagar and fly non-stop down to Kanyakumari. So that is the kind of range the Electric Canberra had. But we retired them. So in the scheme of things, let's talk about in the inventory, are we allowed to hold a bomber squadron or 2 bomber squadrons? Of course we do, because it is there in the piece of paper, and those bombers in place of Canberra could be fulfilled by any strategic long-range bomber. Now let's talk about the why of the bomber. Now, when you look at the requirement, Air Marshal alluded to, from Hormuz to probably Malacca. I would probably extend that Malacca to Sunda and Lombok, because that is where the entire might of the Chinese Navy, PLAN, could enter the Indian Ocean region, and IOR is our playground. Now, if the war is going to be in the IOR, in the chase, we might even have to go to the seas of China and South China Sea and beyond. That is point number 1. Point number 2, Shiv, is even if we are looking at, say, a couple of bombers, half a squadron of bomber, and in this region, our own standing in the South Asian region will certainly go up by having just 4 or 5 or 6 strategic bomber, and Tuplo 160 or any other bomber which is readily available can be procured. And of all the uses that Air Marshal pointed out, I mean, there is a case in point for us to have cruise missiles. Let's take a case, Shiv, that currently we already have a indigenous weapon, that is air-launched BrahMos. Air-launched BrahMos can be, comfortably launched by these bombers over thousands of kilometers without even probably crossing over to South China Sea. So
Okay.
the issue of our ship is going to be providing protection to these bombers. So it cannot operate in a contested area. It has to operate in an uncontested zone.
Okay.
And just one last point, Shiv, is about the stealth. Actually speaking, real stealth does not exist. It is, it is low observable. You can reduce the radar cross section to a certain value X.
Right.
In the case of bomber, that value X still will be much larger than a normal aeroplane. So, with certain kind of radars, especially about a ship, you will be able to pick up these bombers in days to come. So, and operating in a contested zone by any kind of bomber is going to be difficult. So, it has to be a standoff weapon like the cruise missiles that we already have can be utilized. And do we, in the paper, have a case for having a bomber squadron? Of course, we do have, because Canberra squadron, when it bound down, that squadron can now take on bombers. So that is long and short of my stand.
Very, very interesting. I just wanted three views on this topic because this kind of thing keeps popping up from time to time. This has been a very interesting episode of Battle Cry because we've had two of our guests say, now is not the time, maybe in the future, and one of them says, now is the time, why can't we do it? We've got everything required to actually get bombers at this time. Obviously, we won't be deciding. It will be the political establishment and the government deciding based on what the country wants to achieve militarily, strategically, and otherwise. So we leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much, Air Marshal Chopra, Angad, and Group Captain Binod for joining me on this episode of Battle Cry on that question: does India need strategic heavy bombers?